Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Excellent.
Yes, sir.
Hey, so I have been traveling for business this week. So if anybody sent me, I know a few folks sent me some emails on Monday and Tuesday and today, and I didn't respond yet. So give me another day to look at them, I'll look at them and get you some answers. I'm also going to be traveling next week, and so I'll be in St. Louis, probably conducting this class either from one of the offices out there or from my hotel room. So next week's class is normally the slide package is really short, so we go through it really quick. So next week we're going to do a little class exercise. You can see it on my screen. So in the textbook, read the case study for standard products, and then on the week lesson 4 slides on slide 21, we have these questions here. And so read the standard product. It's an easy read. It's only a couple of pages. I think it's 2.5 pages. Take a look at it, and then Team UTC will answer the first question in next week's class, and then Team 2 will answer the Team Prime Aircraft will answer question number 2, and then Team Variance will answer question 3, and then we'll all talk about some similar programs. And I'm only doing that because it's a really short slide package, and we really haven't had a lot of discussion, class discussion, and this will give us the opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas. Any questions on that? You guys all got your team assignments? You know where to get these questions from? Slide 21 in next week's lesson package. I'm going to take that to be yes, we all got it.
Copy, sir.
Okay. Hey, so a couple other things. Great, again, another great job on the discussion questions by most of you. If you're not answering the discussion questions and participating, please do. It's an easy grade. It's 20% of your grade. Get in there. But a lot of really good responses and a lot of good dialogue. So great job. Any questions at all about the supply chain map, the thread diagram, or geographic diagram before we begin tonight's lecture?
I think, sir, I have a question.
Sure.
As we were brainstorming within our Team Aircraft, we were looking at the supply chain, starting with the what we have on post on the base, and also the outside vendors, the civilian vendors. So another topic that we're looking at is possibly, okay, how our unit that we're supporting fits into the overall unit, like we usually have. So should we consider our own unit as a supply chain to the bigger unit that we're supplying the aircraft to? Because we're bouncing that idea around, because in my head I'm looking at supply chain as the, the warehouse, the supply depot, and the civilian, Lockheed Martin, Dowdy, and Rolls-Royce as being the supply chain. But we're trying to see if it's necessary to bring in.
Yeah, so it depends on what you're trying to fix in your master business project, but I would consider you as the customer, right, in your supply chain, because what you're doing is you're generating a requirement for a spare part or a spare engine or something based on a maintenance activity or an aircraft condition, and you're asking the supply chain to fill that for you, and they're either filling it from their warehouse with what they have in inventory, or they're going to a bigger wholesale facility that the Air Force has or the military has, or they're going to an outside supplier to fill that requirement. But I would assume that you're the customer.
Yes, sir.
Does that make sense? So within
Yes,
a
sir.
supply chain map, you would be the end. So you would be the deliverable. The deliverable will be to you, your organization.
Yes.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Any other questions? How about the reading out of the supply chain redesign? You guys find that an easy read, good textbook? Any input on that? Well, you guys are talkative tonight. So if you have any input, please let me know. I find the book really as a really good book, and it's good. It's not really dated because it kind of goes through all the elements of a supply chain. And we're talking about revamping this course. We're certainly for the New England College of Business are probably going to look at it and modify it a little bit. And there might be discussions about changing the textbook or not, but um, you know, in my mind, it's still a good book. But if you guys got any feedback, just let me know. You don't have to do it tonight. The other thing I wanted to talk about before we jumped into tonight's lecture is some of you guys asked me, hey, what's the difference between a 100 or a 94, a lower grade on some of your assignments, right? And most of it's in dealing with the APA research type paperwork assignments. So let me just share that with you. So we have we all the professors throughout your course have a grading rubric for APA type assignments, and what we're looking at is the content of what you did. And so in my mind, I hardly ever give 100, but some of you guys have gotten 100. And so folks have been asking me, well, what's the difference between a 90 to 100, right? And so here's a real easy thing. It's the research and the citation that goes into it. Follow the proper APA format. I don't normally take off of that, but I have responded to some of you guys. Put the abstract in there. Tell me what you're going to tell me in the paper. Put your conclusion. Tell me what you did tell me in your paper, and then make sure you have some kind of a reference page, right? So if you're just referencing Handfield supply chain redesign, that's good. That's a 94. You're going to get that, and as long as your context is good. But a lot of you guys that have gotten better grades than 100 or A plus, you did some other research. You looked at another document. You looked at some kind of web-enabled type data, or you did something else, or you looked at a different book, or you might have used some of your the military documents that you had at work or some other, and you actually cited something in your thing, and you reference that on your citation. And what that does, it adds value. Tells me that you did a little. Besides reading, you had to put a little thought into it, and you did a little extra research, as well as it gave credibility to what you were trying to say in the APA paper format. And so that's the real simple story between getting an A or an A plus. And I'm only bringing that up because several folks had asked me about it, and I figured, okay, I'd share that. Any questions on any of that?
No, sir.
All right, good. I'm just seeing that Matthew just joined us. I know some folks have been having other issues. So, okay, let's see. I'm trying to think if there's any other topic I wanted to discuss with you guys, but I think you guys are doing good. You're doing good on the discussion forum, and really great job on the assignments. So keep that up. Yes.
I have a question when you refer to the NECB, New England College of Business.
Yes.
I know that I don't know if it's the right form or might will help out. How because we need to register with the school, and at first I thought it was gonna be an easy process to transition. So I'm trying to understand how that'll balance out between NGS and NECB. Because right now we have to register. I've received a couple of emails in regards to registering profile and the type of information they ask. And I'm like, okay. So, I mean, how is all of that meshing? Thinking.
Yeah, so I think it's meshing, right? So we as adjunct professors had to reapply for our job and take a little assessment, and then also do a profile similar to what you guys are doing. I assume you guys are all registering and doing your profile on the I'm trying to think on through the Education Council. the ECB SharePoint that they sent via the email. So I found it pretty interesting too, because the profiles are a lot more complex than NGS. But I think it's meshing. As if we really think about it, NGS. Nothing's changed, right? We're still using the same cohort function. We're still going through the lesson plans for the cohorts that are currently in place. But you guys are getting ready to graduate, right? And so you probably want to register as quickly as you can, right? We're in week 3 here, so you got week 4 and 5, and then you're going to go into your master business project. So you kind of get down to the wire here, but I would go in there and do your profile. It's not, like I said, it's not, they're asked for a lot of data as you do that, but it's fairly quick. You could do a cut and paste from maybe your resume or existing document. I know when I did my profile, if anybody's on LinkedIn, they had a link to the LinkedIn, and so I did that because a lot of what they were asking was already there, and so it kind of came over. So if you want to do that, so I think it's meshing. I think just like any other merger between any other, it's just like we're going to talk a little about that tonight. Just like in the supply chains, with companies acquiring each other and merging together and forming a stronger bond, there's always that duplication of effort and synergies that have to be brought out. But I think it's meshing. I think there's a lot going on, right, behind the wheel, because you're bringing in 2 very large organizations and making them one. So I think it's good. I think it's a good deal. And I don't even know if I answered your question or not.
No, yes, you got it, sir. It was quite peculiar, the long list of things we have, which was quite different from when we registered with NGS. So interesting, but yes, keep talking along.
Yeah, so I noticed that too. It's the same thing when, so it was a long time ago. I think it was 2009. I mean, and I am a NGS graduate, right? So I've taken the same course you guys have taken right now. So back in 2008, 2009, I took this course, and I didn't remember and even when I became an adjunct professor and I started teaching them not shortly after I took this course in 2009, the summer of 2009, I didn't recall going through all the paperwork and all the profiles and all the other stuff that New England College of Business. But they're a bigger organization. They're part of a much larger school, right? So if you went in there and you did when you go on your profile and you look at it, they're part of the Education Corporation of America, which has a lot of different schools associated with it, and you could look at the history. So you're talking about a small non-profit national graduate school that's merging with a gigantic organization. So I think it's going to be great in the future for all the students and the adjunct staff. So I'm actually looking forward to it. Should be good.
Thank you.
But don't procrastinate on those profiles, because you guys are pretty close to graduation, which is great. Yeah. Any other questions before we begin? Okay. So tonight we're going to talk about the financial impact of supply chain decisions. And we'll go through some of the insourcing and outsourcing decisions, or make or buy. Another term for that is make or buy. And we'll talk about the strategic cost management of global supply chains. Get into that. And if you guys did your reading, we're gonna recap a lot of what was in there, right? So really, to enhance the value provided by your supply chain, you really need to start by understanding your customers, right? What's their most important requirements? It's sort of like what we just talked about at the beginning of this. I'm the customer. I need my engine parts when I need my engine parts, right? Or it might be that I need it not so much on a scheduled cycle, but I need a better cost for those engine parts or something like that, right? So you're going to develop normally what you'll do is you develop a market risk analysis and determine if that business, that service, or that product will bring value to your business and your supply chain, right? And Hanfield went on to discuss that in chapter 4 on page 115 in a lot of great detail, and it's really worthwhile reading if you haven't done that. And again, collaboration again is a large factor, right? You have to share with your suppliers your product development schedules, your forecast, your needs, your requirements, right? The market risk analysis findings, your capacity planning, any inventory positions or concerns that you may have, right? Collaboration is the key, right? Collaborate on your performance metrics in terms of your technology, your potential for growth, your profitability as well, any risk issues or opportunities as you think you're seeing, and then again to show the connection, your score, uh, geographic map and thread diagram, and your supply chain mapping methodologies will help with that understanding, right? So once you've defined your supply chain, and we talked about that in the process steps in this week's discussion question. The next step is to determine your company's internal competencies. What are you really good at? And then you can compare them with other supply chain members or organizations. And this will identify which organizations or companies are best suited to perform any specific activity you're looking at. And this is commonly called insourcing or outsourcing analysis, right? And so a lot of you guys in the discussion question said, hey, yeah, once you map out your process, there's a value there, right? You can see that from tip to tail, the whole thing. You can identify where you might have waste or where you might have issues or risks. So there's a value in those mapping activities that really gives you some kind of information on the financial aspect of that value of those maps. So Hanfield on page 118 in chapter 4, he goes on to talk about and define outsourcing and insourcing, right? So outsourcing is subcontracting a service such as product design or manufacturing to a third-party company. The decision whether to outsource or to do in-house or insource is often based upon either achieving some kind of a lower production cost or making better use of your available resources that you have in-source, or focusing energy on your core competencies of your particular organization or business, or just making more efficient use of labor, capital, information technology, or land resources, those financial impacts. And that's why most companies either insource or outsource, really driven by that financial aspect. So your first team assignment, you're going to read the IBM case study in the textbook. It begins on page 113. Again, very, very easy read, right? And you're gonna answer these questions, right? What motivated IBM's restructuring or focus, and what may have contributed to this, right? So just to give you a quick background, because you probably haven't read this yet, right? Here's my theory on what turns around things quickly. Crisis brings about the best change, right? When you have a crisis on hand, you see all your employees, all your workforce working to fix that, and they do a great job. And if you could bottle that and fix all your initiatives and all your processes, that would be great, because I've seen it over again. So normally crisis brings about change. So in IBM's case study, you're going to read it, right? IBM lost $15 billion in the 90s. Right? $15 billion. Most companies would not be able to survive. IBM is good, right? And so that crisis brought about some major changes in IBM. And they've been around a long time. So you're going to look at that. You're going to answer these questions as a team in an APA format, and then submit it, and we'll go from there. Any questions on that first team assignment? Again, the case study is dealing with what we're dealing with today, the financial impacts and the insourcing, outsourcing decisions. And I'm sorry, did I cut somebody off? Somebody have a question? Okay. So Hanfield goes in your reading this week. He talks about what a sweet spot is, right? and what a sweet spot analysis is. So any sweet spot analysis, again, like your side pocket, like your value stream map and others, has to begin with the customer, right? What is it that you want to provide, and how best to structure your business to provide that to your customers? So you're going to when you define your sweet spot, you're going to review your market risk analysis that I just mentioned earlier. You're going to look at your strategic business plans. You're going to look at your current and future value states, right? And you're going to look at your short and long-term supply chain technology roadmaps, and that's going to really help you to narrow down where that sweet spot is. And there's a criteria for that decision, right? So what's the relationship of your core competency to finding your sweet spot, right? What's the difference between a capability and a competence, right? So an organizational capability can also be a core competency when that capability is valued by your customer. That capability can be applied across multiple business units or products, and that capability is unique and it cannot be easily imitated by your competitors, right? Handfield goes on to explain that in a lot of detail on page 122. So core competencies provide advantages to you in cost, technology, flexibility, or overall capability. So I'll give you a quick example, right? Somebody mentioned last week H-60s. So is there a Coast Guard out? Is there a helicopter guy out there in this cohort? Or was that somebody else? Who's in the Coast Guard? Anybody in the Coast Guard?
We do have 60s.
And your Army?
Air Force.
Air Force. So PAVOX, Combat Search and Rescue, PAVOX. So
yes, sir.
So let me talk about capability and core competencies. So Sikorsky, who's now Lockheed, makes the H-60, and there's thousands of H-60 aircrafts out there in the world, right? You got Armies flying them Blackhawks, Coast Guard's flying them Jayhawks or Seahawks, Navy's flying them Jayhawks or Seahawks, and the Air Force is flying them PAVOX, right? They're all associated with the H-60 Blackhawk, and then there's a bunch of international allies that are also flying them. And they have some pretty stringent rotor blades on there. It's like unbelievable rotor blades, composite type material, right? And so Lockheed Martin, Sikorsky will tell you that one of their core competencies is rotor blades, right? And why is that? Well, rotor blades are not easy to manufacture, right? It's a composite blade that, it's the lifting body of a helicopter. And so when you look at North America, there's 4 companies in all of North America that makes rotor blades, right? You got Lockheed Martin, Sikorsky, and they're just not doing H-60s, but they're doing H-53s and all their products, S-92 for their product. And then you got Bell Helicopters, Textron that makes rotor blades. And then you got Boeing, who makes rotor blades for their products. And then you got another company, Command Helicopters, which is up in the Northeast in Connecticut, and they make rotor blades too. So 4 companies in all of North America that makes, and we're talking large rotor blades. So the rotor blade is several feet on a Blackhawk, right? 4 companies. All 4 of those companies will tell you that the core competency to them is those rotor blades, right? If you want a Blackhawk rotor blade, you got to go to Lockheed Martin and Sikorsky if you want it. If you want a CH-47 Chinook rotor blade, you got to go to Boeing, right? If you want a V-22 rotor blade, you got to go to Bell, right? And Command's got some logging helicopters. If you want you want a rotor blade for that, you got to. So they're going to tell you that's their core competency because that capability is valued by the customers that are flying those helicopters. That capability can be applied across all their multiple products, right? All their different type helicopters. They'll put different rotor blades on them, but their processes for making those blades are similar in how they track and balance them in a roll tower usually. And then that capability, the most important is that capability is unique and it can't easily be imitated by competitors. If it was, there'd be more than 4 North American manufacturers of serious rotor blades, right? And so that's an example of a core competency that's going to provide you advantage in cost, technology, flexibility, or overall capability. That's just one example of many, and I'm sure you guys probably have. Can anybody think of another example of somebody that has a product that's not easily manufactured or produced by somebody else? Man, you guys are quiet, man. Somebody has an example. You guys just don't want to share it.
I would say, I mean, in the Intel world, we have some systems that we have specific suppliers for. We do not like go outside much. We have a specific supplier we go to for, like a system we call D6A. We have specific group of people who handle that. So outside of that, we don't know anybody else who does it.
And I'm sorry, what did you say? I'm sorry, did you say within what, the intelligence field? Is that what you said?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Yeah.
The tools that we use are very specific to our job. So it's
Right.
not just any manufacturer that we can go to get it.
Yeah, so that's really a good example, right? You know, if you're providing intelligence, especially in the military world, right, you're getting data from specific sources, and it's just not readily available, right? You know, between the NSA, the CIA, and some of the other government agencies that are the NRO and others that are tracking data. That's not readily available to everybody, but those systems that are using it, again, those systems are highly a lot of data analytics in them and a lot of data mining, and a lot of that system data is proprietary to those suppliers that make it, and they realize that that's a value, right? Because it hits those same requirements, right? When you're talking about, and you'll see that not only in the intelligence world, but anybody that's mining data today, right? It's certainly the data is valued by the customers because they're making some really big major decisions based on that. And again, that data could be used for those specific products or missions that they're doing. And then it's unique. It can't really be easily imitated by competitors. So that's a good example, especially on the data side of it. So thank you for sharing. Anybody else have one to share before we move on?
Would SpaceX count?
Yeah. So SpaceX is pretty interesting, right? If you think about that, right? So there's some unique things that that CEO is doing, right? And it's not just if who even thought about using reusable rocket boosters, right? We've been in the space industry since the 60s and earlier, right? Putting satellites up, and we've been just throwing away rocket boosters, and along comes the SpaceX team. They say, hey, we're going to reuse rocket boosters because that's what we've seen in the movies, right? We see people reuse, going from atmosphere to atmosphere, reusing the same vehicles, right? And so I think that's what the future is. So certainly a lot of what they're doing, they're spending a lot of money. There's not a lot that there was nobody looking at reusing rocket boosters before SpaceX started it, so that's unique. But SpaceX, if you Google them, right, they're doing all kinds of unique things, like the tunnel in LA, right, the tunnel in the Southern California. If anybody's ever drove on the 405 or anything like that, it's just gridlock at certain times of the day. So some of the technology that SpaceX developed, they're now using for tunneling to relieve some traffic congestion. So that's a good thing. But I don't. So what specifically were you talking about when you were talking about SpaceX besides the rocket booster that I brought up?
It was just more so like being pretty much the private company outside of like NASA or other bodies that do space exploration. They're kind of the ones that are just up and coming, and they're very specified based on what they do.
Yeah. So there was a niche market, So that was one of those areas where if you wanted a satellite up, you'd have to build your own NASA organization, right? So NASA was the one that was putting all our satellites up in the early days, right? Today, so SpaceX was one of those first ones that popped up. That said, hey, we could put any kind of satellites in space, and that's where you make your money, right? Or we could build satellites and put them in there. So, but today, it's not. I wouldn't call it a niche market anymore, because if I built a satellite in my basement, I could call a bunch of dozen different companies around the world, say, hey, I want this satellite launched for me. Not cheap to launch a satellite, but there's a lot of folks doing that. But SpaceX was certainly one of the ones that started that, right? They're still cutting edge with everything. And by the way, we're going to talk insourcing and outsourcing tonight. So the SpaceX has a relationship with almost every large launch customer, right? So for example, Boeing has been launching rockets and putting satellites in space for a while, and they've been building like a SpaceX, right? They've been building those vehicles that could fly up through the atmosphere and go halfway around the world and come back and still fly within our atmosphere, right? So you can go out. But they're all teamed up. SpaceX is in there. People figure, okay, that we're going to go through the slides here, but when you're trying to make insourcing, outsourcing, somebody that has technology that you don't have is a good reason to outsource that work, because they're ahead of the game on that technology than necessarily you are. So we're going to talk. So that's a good example. And when I get to that part, we'll talk a little bit more about why people would use somebody like SpaceX. All right. So there is a way to get a sweet spot analysis, right? You can figure out your sweet spot by, again, looking at your market analysis, right? Look at the size, that potential market share that's out there. Those sourcing analysis, understand your supply base and your supplier's capability. That's a collaboration there, right? And then look at your core competencies. Understand your insourcing and outsourcing plans. A lot of folks don't do that. They just make rash decisions, but you need to understand and look at it. And then you need to perform a cost analysis on that. Now, cost doesn't always dictate why you're doing insourcing, outsourcing, but it's a good thing. But if you decide to outsource or you decide to insource, certainly do your cost analysis. And again, start with your SWOT, right? Your strengths, weakness, opportunity, threats, right? Hanfield actually says that in the textbook, and you're reading this week, right, on page 125. That SWOT gives you a lot of value right there. And again, just so if you guys don't remember, right, you guys all do the SWOT analysis in one of your other classes?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So right when you did that and you analyze it, right, it looks at your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats, and necessary when analyzing your present situation, right? And so typically your strengths and weaknesses surface while you're compiling baseline data, and then looking at your internal processes, resources, and capabilities of the organization, right? And then opportunities and threats tend to surface while you're conducting that environmental scan, you're listening to your suppliers and collaborating with them, you're talking to your customers, internal and external stakeholders, not just external customers, but both, right? And then you're identifying your strengths and weaknesses, and we consider those that are within your control, right? And then you're identifying those opportunities and threats that are outside influences over which you have little control, right? Society trends or technology factors or government policies, right? And then you explore how these will influence what you're trying to do when you're doing insources. So SWOT becomes a very valuable tool as you go through and make those insourcing, outsourcing decisions. And so like I said earlier, there's a relationship to core competencies defining your sweet spot, right? So what is the difference between a capability and competency, which we talked about, right? If you always go back to saying the capability is valued by your customer, it could be applied across your organization for either different products or services, and then it's unique, right? It can't be easily uh, imitated by your competitors. Now you start when you start define your capability as that. Now you're going and they meet those three criteria. Now it's a competency, and those competencies relate to your sweet spot, right? So so core competencies provide advantages in cost, that technology, that flexibility, and that overall capability. And that's what you really are looking to do. And so why are we talking about sweet spots and core competencies and your capabilities? Those are things you don't want to outsource, right? Those are things that are crazy to outsource, because that's what's making you valuable, right? So how do you determine those, right? So core competencies, again, they provide advantage in course, technology, flexibility, or your overall capability, right? And this is where your score thread diagrams and your geographic maps will help, right? You'll review your material and your information flows. You'll understand your cycle times. You'll look at those production lead times, your performance levels, your capacity levels, your market demands, and then any emerging technologies that's in there, right? And then that helps you to start performing that make or buy analysis, right? Because it's going to take so your core competencies will highlight and say, okay, well, we got to keep that in house or something like that, right? So again, outsourcing is subcontracting their service, right? Like I mentioned earlier, such as product design and manufacturing to a third party company. The decision whether to outsource or do in house, again, could be based on a bunch of different reasons, right? Lower your production costs, make better use of your resources, right? And then focus energy on your core competencies of a particular business. Again, you might have to outsource because you don't have the technology, you don't have the subject matter experts in a particular technical field that you need, and that's why folks are teaming up with SpaceX, because they have that knowledge, they have that technology that would take you, it might take you years to develop that in-house. And so a lot of times it's just easier to go buy that and outsource it to a technology house. So there's a lot of factors that drive outsourcing decisions, and I just mentioned technology. Here on this slide, there's a few. This is nowhere near the amount. So if you read Hanfield on page 16, but there's all kinds of, besides financial, quality, speed, process, data systems, you got cost savings that you might be looking at, right? You're trying to lower your overall cost of a service to the business, right? It might be so that you could be more competitive with a better competitive rate. So that normally when you talk about cost savings, it could be initiative driven, right? Where you're going to have cost savings and cost avoidance for future years. But it'll involve reducing some kind of scope, defining your quality levels, repricing, renegotiation, cost restructuring, or access to lower cost economies, right? If you got lower business rates in India or Mexico or something, you might say, okay, there's an existing workforce there, and it might make sense to help you reduce your cost structure and get better competitive rates. And that's where another one is that cost restructuring, right? Your operating leverage is a measure that compares all your fixed costs to your variable costs, right? So outsourcing changes that balance of that ratio by offering a move from a fixed to a variable cost, and also by making those variable costs more predictable. So that cost restructure might be a reason why you outsource. Or you strictly want to focus on your core business, like we talked about in the last few slides, right? So resources, for example, you want to invest in your people and your infrastructure and focus on developing your core business. For example, often organizations will outsource their entire IT department, right, to specialized IT services because it's not their core business. They don't want to be messing with getting laptops and monitors and computing equipment for the employees. Let somebody else deal with that. Let somebody else buy Microsoft Word and get it all loaded on the thing. That because it's not their business, right? And so you'll see a lot of companies outsource that. Some folks will say, well, they outsourced our entire IT department and it stinks because it takes forever to get a computer now. But if you look at the cost value of doing that, there's probably some significant savings there. You might outsource to improve your quality, right? What you're trying to do is achieve those step changes in quality through contracting out the service with some new service level agreement to improve that quality. You might do knowledge, right? It's that SpaceX example again, right? Access to intellectual property that you don't have, right? Or wider experience and knowledge, right? You might do it because the contract says you do it, right? There's a lot of government contracts that says, hey, you have a legally binding obligation to contract X amount of work to a small business owned, and it might be minority owned, veteran owned, woman owned. What am I thinking of? So there's terms in there. It's called within the terms and conditions of your contract, it says a percentage will go to small business-owned companies, or it might be like what they call offsets, or if you're dealing internationally and you're selling product internationally, that country might say, okay, great, we're going to buy your product, but I need an offset, and you're going to put X amount of work in my country, whether they're doing repair or services or you're buying product from us, offset. So it might be a contractual obligation why you're outsourcing some of your work. And then that operational expertise, right? Access to the best practices that would be too difficult or time consuming to develop in-house. Access to talent. It might be because you just don't have the capacity or the resources. You might be looking for a catalyst for change, so you're going to do that. You might want to enhance your capacity for innovation and go out for that. You might want to be reducing your time to market. You might want to be doing commoditization. You might outsource for risk management, venture capital, tax benefits, scalabilities, offsets, all kinds of reasons, right? Besides the 6, 7 that are listed on this chart. Any other factors that are driving outsourcing decisions that you guys can think of? Almost everybody that's in the in an organization today, in any kind of manufacturing organization, have probably had some area outsourced. Does anybody want to talk about that or share an experience that they might have came up with? Even in the military, they outsource their IT. So, examples? Well, you guys are quiet, man. Somebody has to have an example of a product or something they outsource.
So this is Sam.
Go
ahead.
No, go ahead, Sam. Go ahead.
I used to work at a trailer manufacturer, and we would make tow dollies and utility trailers here in North Carolina. As we started competing with China more and more, the owner looked to import the frame of our tow dollies from China, bring them here and assemble in the United States. So yeah, that's what I got.
Yeah. Well, that's a good example because a lot of folks are moving manufacturing to or have moved manufacturing to China because the rate is so different, right? And when you're looking at a burden rate, you're talking about not only the salary you're paying your employees, but the cost of your equipment, the cost of your facilities, the rent of your facilities, the insurance, the heat, water, electric bills of your facility, HVAC of your facility, and then the maintenance and sustainment of those, and the taxes and everything else. So a lot of companies do that, and that's a touchy subject for a lot of individuals because we feel like we gave the manufacturing base away to other countries. But when you're looking at the financial aspect of it, it's, you could get things manufactured a lot cheaper in China and other parts of the world than you could do here in the States. And it's not necessarily the salary, even though people say the salary. It's just all the burdens and the allocations that we put on a company. All those things outside. Just the insurance alone. When you got a workforce and you're paying medical insurance, that all goes in your rates, right? Life insurance, if you're paying to your employees, that's in your rates, right? Everything's built into your rate, and that's where a lot of companies make that decision to outsource because they're trying to reduce our rate. Somebody else but that's a good example. So somebody else had an example they were going to share with us.
I was trying to consider if would independent lab testing for whatever aspect be one of those that could be outsourced.
Oh yeah, sure. So every company does that, right? So if you're doing and it could be anything from doing drug testing for new employees or doing or checking the quality of your product, like the folks that pasteurize milk might use a third-party provider to check the quality of that, or folks that make paint are going to an outside to an independent lab. And why would you do that, right? So if anybody was in a lab environment, like I'll use the urinalysis drug testing that a lot of the companies are using, they're going to outsource that because then for one, they don't want to pay the fee for lab technicians when it's not a constant need, right? There's not the capacity is not there. You're not going to be utilizing this person 8 hours a day, 160 hours a month, right? And so you're going to outsource that if you don't need them that full time. Plus the equipment, the lab equipment to do that is costly. It's expensive to sustain. So yeah, absolutely, using an outside supplier to do lab work for you makes perfect sense, and most companies would do that because they just don't want to fund the resources. So good example. Thanks for sharing that. Oops, sorry, went too far ahead. So you really have to determine the optimal mix that you want in your organization for outsourcing and insourcing. And Handfill goes on to explain that, page 116 of your reading, right? So you want to look at your financial performance, right? What will be your return on your investment, whether you're insource or outsource, right? Will it be profitable, right? You got to understand your planned revenue, your earnings, your margins, your economic profit, as well as your growth potential, right? So financial performance really plays a key in a lot of that decision. You want to understand your product and the materials that make it, right? Are there suppliers available? Are there shortage concerns, right? Like I mentioned, I gave you the example of titanium, right? Are there critical processes or items in your manufacturing that you have to look at? Are there obsolescence issues, right? In your electronics, your avionics, right? Anybody that's familiar with displays, like on aircraft, multifunction displays, your touch screens on your tablets. I have a large, what I'm looking at right now is a large touch screen monitor, Dell monitor that I have in my office here. It's that display technology was changing almost daily, right? And it's still changing, probably slowing down a little bit, but it was changing daily, right? And so if you were a display manufacturer or user of displays, like mostly all aircraft manufacturers have multifunctional displays. We call them glass cockpits right now. There's no more steam gauges or mechanical or digital or analog type gauges in a cockpit today. We have multifunctional displays. Some of them are touch displays that help the pilot and the air crew gather all the data they need in a quicker manner, right? But that technology changed almost daily, right? So you could go buy a whole bunch of multifunction displays today and then install them on your aircraft, and they're obsolete by the time you do it. So a lot of the decisions there would be, okay, do I really want to build technology on displays when it's changing so drastically? So you're going to look at that, right? And then you're going to look at your manufacturing equipment, your tooling cost, and the cost to make, not only to build that tooling and manufacturing equipment, but the cost annually to sustain it, right? That could be a reason why. Do you really want to make an investment in a $1 million transmission test stand for aircraft when somebody else already has them, right? And engine transmissions for military type aircraft, those test stands are not only expensive, but they're expensive to sustain. So I know you guys are, one of your teams are working an engine master business project. Do you guys have a run house, an engine run house on your base?
So the engine seal issue we're dealing with. I mean, we have a test facility, not necessarily for complete engines, but test stands that you can actually put the seal or components into, and it tests it like it's on an engine.
Okay, so I think some of us talked fighters. I think it was in this class, right? So if you looked at a jet engine, a lot of the bases put test cells in there, what they call an engine test cell, and so they could roll an engine on a test stand, strap it down, and run it in that test cell to check the performance of that engine before they put on an aircraft. That's an area that not only the U.S. Air Force and other DoD militaries, but everybody has looked at and said, hey, do I want to invest in an engine test cell? Almost every fighter squadron in the Air Force at one time had a test cell on their thing. And they're slowly going away from that because, first of all, it's a $1 million facility. I'm talking $12 to $14 million to build a facility, and then you're going to spend $1 million annually to sustain it. And so when you start talking those numbers, that's where you're looking at from a financial aspect. Does it make sense to do that everywhere where you're flying fighter aircraft, or could you outsource that to, bases that are in a geographic location and save some things? So that's why I brought it up. So sometimes you're going to do that just because the tooling and the equipment, the costs are just enormous, and you'll try to figure out, maybe I could outsource it and save some areas. Again, the best way to make those decisions is to know yours and your supplier core competencies, right? And that's again where that collaboration comes in. Sharing what you guys know and what you don't know, and your best practices will help in those insourcing and outsourcing decisions. So initiating that insourcing and outsourcing decision. Again, Hanfield goes into explaining it in a lot of detail in chapter 4, right? But there needs to be a balance between profit and risk, right? If you make a decision, you go to your CEO or your commanding officer or somebody, they're going to say, okay, well, where's the balance? What's the balance to profit and risk? So you need to do that. A RIO analysis or a risk issue and opportunity analysis with a mitigation plan for any risk or issues that you identify certainly will help. Again, I'd start with your SWOT, right? Do that SWOT analysis, right? Understand the strengths, weakness, opportunities, and the threats, right? And then to keep these factors in mind, right? Your new product development, not only the capacity that you have, the resources you have, does your new product need any new tooling? Does it need new parts? Does it need new suppliers? What's the cycle time? What's the time? What's the cost associated with it? And then look at your strategy, right? You look at your long-term, your short-term plans to see if that's part of what you're trying to build in your organization. Is that the core competencies you want? Are those the sweet spots you want? And then look at, if you got poor performance, repeated poor performance, that might be an easy decision right there. Again, when you outsource, you still have to manage that supplier. So you have to look at their performance, their quality, right? And stuff like that. And then look at that change in demand pattern, right? If your product if you got new product that's coming in and your older product is just not driving a lot of demand, right? You might say, okay, I'm gonna shut that line down because it's too expensive, and I'll outsource that that smaller demand to somebody else, right? Instead of keeping that expensive resources tied up. And then again, like my example with the multifunction display, look at those shifted technology life cycles. We've seen that over the last in our century, not only in the between the 20th and 21st century, you've just seen technology change so drastically, right? If you're an old person like me, you didn't have cell phones in the 80s, right? So today we all rely on our cell phones. We all rely on our tablets or our laptops. Man, those things didn't exist in the late 70s and early 80s like they do now. So that technology changes, right? It goes back to VHS recorders and DVD players and CDs. That's pretty much gone today, right? So you that technology changes, and you got to stay on top of that. And those are some of the reasons what you're going to consider when you're doing your insourcing, outsourcing. Skip a slide here. Process technology considerations, right? So process technology considerations, again, page 123, 124, your textbook really gives you a good understanding, right? But here's what will help you with those technology considerations, right? Understand your process capabilities, right? Just like we talked in the discussion questions, do that value stream map. Do the score thread diagrams. Look at them. They're going to help you, right? And then understand what you excel in, right? What are yours and your supplier's core competencies? What's your key manufacturing processes? And then understand your process technology as it relates to your competitors, right? If your competitors are way ahead of you, maybe you should just outsource that piece of it. And then know the maturity of your process technology. We're going to talk a little about that next week, but understand the maturity of where you're at in your processes, right? And that again requires collaboration with your suppliers, doing benchmarking and understanding those best practices. And then understand where in your process provides that competitive advantage. Where's your intellectual property that's going to give you that competitive advantage within your processes? You need to understand that to really make good decisions for insourcing, outsourcing, right? And just like anything, there's pros and cons, right? So there's a lot of advantages for insourcing, right? You can keep control over everything within those processes, right? It gives you the better visibility because you're there looking at it, right? It gives you economy of scales because you could move resources around as you need them. But there's disadvantages in it. You're paying more, right? You're dedicating your resources, your equipment, your personnel, and your budgets to that things, and then you're relying on an outside supply chain anyway, most of the times, right? There's advantage to outsourcing, right? It gives you certainly gives you a lot more flexibility. Helps to look at where you want to reduce your costs, right, and your rates, and be more competitive. It'll certainly lower your investment risk if you have to buy new tooling and manufacturing and buildings and whatnot. So you have that potential to certainly reduce your labor costs because now you're outsourcing that and you don't need those resources that you would have normally did that. And then, but there's disadvantages, right? People make wrong choices all the time. I'll give you an example of the one. Right, and you could lose control over your process and potential fire. So I'll tell you what happened about well over a decade ago. Was in their mid 90s. So I've been involved in some make or buy decisions and sourcing out the sourcing decisions as I progressed in my career. We had a machine shop at the facility I worked that employed maybe about 50 artisans in there. And if anybody's ever worked in a machine shop, it's a dirty, oily place. But the skill set that's required to machine complex parts, and we were machining, most of the machine shop was machining gears and bearings. And so gears and bearings have to be precise. And these gears and bearings were going into engine transmissions and other aircraft parts that were critical, flight critical, safety of flight items. So the machining was had to be first time quality, 100% first time quality, inspections all along, right? And so somebody came up with the idea that said, hey, And by the way, this shop that employed about 50, this machine shop that employed 50 shops on site, was producing 100% first time quality. Very, very minimal quality issues coming out of that. But it was very costly machine shop, very costly, right? At least that's what the folks that were looking at insourcing decisions were looking at. They were looking strictly at the cost of keeping that small machine shop within their manufacturing environment. Machining equipment was expensive. It went through drill heads and cutting heads extensively. But that's just the price of a machine shop. And so there's a lot of niche companies out there that do machining. And so somebody made a decision that, hey, we're going to outsource the entire machine shop. So they closed it down and they went to a company, and I'm going to use company names because some of these companies aren't around anymore. They went to a company called Chicago Gearworks. And so Chicago Gearworks took over all the work that those folks were doing in that machine shop, and they could never meet the capacity that was required. And then then for the first time ever, there was quality issues. So now everybody thought, oh, we made a bad mistake on our outsourcing. We should have kept that insourcing. Even though it reduced cost, it was driving cost up in other areas because now we had rework. We were late on deliverables because they couldn't match the capacity. Went in there and leaned out their machine shop. Tried to educate them on the proper machining of Gearworks. Again, still weren't getting the quality, still weren't getting the capacity. Now, somebody realized, hey, we made it was a mistake outsourcing that work. So the company I work for went and bought Chicago Gearworks. Bought them. So now we spent more money. The whole reason why we made that outsourcing decision to begin with. Even when we bought them, the culture, it was taking us way too long to build it the way we wanted to. And so we bought it, worked it 3 or 4 years now we made this decision in the late 90s. Now it's the 2000s. Couldn't turn Chicago Gearworks around. So we ended up outsourcing again to North Star, which is another machine gear thing. And we sold Chicago Gearworks to somebody else, no longer named Chicago Gearworks. So now North Star is our outsourcing supplier. Quality improved, capacity didn't, right? And so here we are almost 2 decades later. North Star's gone, by the way. They were bought up, they were acquired by another shop. But two decades later, still getting good quality gears. Capacity has still been an issue, but not as bad as it was. So again, doing everything we did, trying to make the right decisions, there's still the possibility of those wrong choices. I think the wrong choices we made, that we just waited too long to try to fix everything, and it just propagated, and before you know it, we spent millions and millions of dollars when we were trying to save $1 million. So make sure when you're doing that, it's not all about the cost. Make sure you're looking at all the aspects of insourcing and all the pros and cons. Anybody got anything to ask up to this point, or anything to share?
I have something. I just wanted to say, you can do both of those really well internally in your own company. I mean, my company does that, where they'll open a plant in a low-cost country, and then we'll outsource it from here to that other plant. So we still control our IP, the process, all those things, but it's produced in a plant in a low-cost country. So we don't have all the issues that you would have outsourcing to a third party, and we still get all the profitability from outsourcing.
Yeah, so I work for a very large aerospace manufacturing company. It's a global company. So we have facilities in Australia, UK, a very large facility in India, and so we outsource to India all the time. So we still have some control because they're within our company, um, but but there's still advantages and disadvantages of that. Advantages is that you can really reduce your rate structure, or capitalize on technology like what we get from Australia and the UK. So that's a good example. The other thing, there's a large trend within the industry today. You'll see more insourcing than outsourcing. People are bringing work back in, right? So I could tell you from an aircraft manufacturing standpoint, several years ago we made product and we relied almost 90% on our supply base. And we had some epic fails on some big major platforms that drove up cost. And so you see it's a lot easier to sit there and say, hey, we need to bring that in-house today when you have epic fails. Crisis brings about change, right? And so you'll see a lot more folks trying to control their own destiny and bringing a lot more work in large manufacturing facilities than you did. And I'll tell you, through the 90s, there was a whole bunch of folks outsourcing, and I see that trend going in the opposite sides. But you could do it successfully as long as you collaborate and manage it, right? And again, that collaboration goes back to, hey, we have the same metrics in place. We're measuring capacity, cycle time, quality the same way. We're measuring costs the same way, right? And you're collaborating on that and sharing. You could pretty much mitigate the risk from using any outsourcing company. But I do see it coming back. So thank you for sharing. Hey, so week 3 discussion question. This we're going to talk. You're going to talk about that, right? So look at your organizations, right, and see what benefits are there, right, and then talk about what your feelings are for companies' decisions to outsource and what's those impacts on those decisions. We talked about some of them today. And then how well did those decisions impact, right? So these could include anything, right? New product development, strategy development, investing, divesting core businesses, poor external performance, right? Your business units' internal performance can't be met or whatever, changing demand patterns, right? Whatever. And so go through that, and then your individual assignment this week again deals with the same topic, right? So look at the case study, the Cummins Engines case study on page 135. I think it's about 5 or 6 pages, right? And look at what they decided when they were trying to figure out what their core competencies are and what they're insourcing and outsourcing things. Any questions on those 2 assignments? The discussion question, the individual assignment?
Okay.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the Cummins Engine case outsourcing process, right? So, this is right. They're looking at part process family strategies, right? And looking where they could partner where it was necessary. And so they're an engine manufacturer. Some of you guys work in engines. The product within engines that are that you can do, like machine parts, for example. You could core up a lot of that stuff and put it in the same processes, right? Because they're related. So when there's a relationship there, that you could do that. Nuts, bolts, hardware, rotor bin type stock, pan stock, housings, casings, stuff like that. And then you could figure out what it costs. So say you were doing casting for we'll pick an automobile engine, right? So your automobile engine block is normally a casting, and then it's machined out, right? So if you're doing machining and casting or building housings or engine blocks, do you want to do that? You want to buy the raw material? Do you want to buy the stock? I can tell you right now, most of the engine manufacturers aren't making their engine blocks, right? They're buying them, and then they're doing their machining on them, and then they're they're sticking the pistons and the valves and everything in there. And so you make a decision whether you want to do that, or do you want to go to a specialty casting and forging or housing manufacturer. And you'll see that across the board. A lot of folks are using those houses to make their engine transmissions and their engine blocks and their housings and other things. So you could do that by family grouping of your parts. But I'm not going to get too much into it because you guys are going to read the case study and then you're going to come up with a process similar to what I just showed you. I got a couple of slides here for in-class assignments. We're not going to do that, but again, next week we are going to do an in-class assignment. So, so here's a good slide, right? And I think this is in your textbook, right? So there's no question that supply chain management can have a dramatic impact on your profitability and cost, right? If you were to look at the financial statements of an average organization, and try to guess how much of their company spends on goods and services, this is a good example. This is right from the Supply Chain Council. So in manufacturing, that figure is high, right? The average manufacturer is going to spend approximately 56 cents out of every dollar, or 56% of every dollar of revenue on purchased materials, right? So for some industries, this figure could even be higher. So when this much of a firm's revenue is spent on materials, as well as those services and improving the supply chain performance, that any improvement in that represents a major opportunity to increase your profitability, right? And so I said 56% of every dollar of revenue. So revenue is the money that you're bringing into your organization and company every day. That revenue pays. That's what your the costs that are coming in, minus all your fees and all that. Revenue is what drives every organization. You guys probably did this in your finance class, but revenue is the money before the economic profit, your margins and your fees. That revenue pays everything, right? It pays everything, it pays your employees. So when you're spending 56% of that on material, the slightest improvement in that is going to yield some big benefits. So why do I share that? Insourcing and outsourcing decisions could impact that. So doing the right analysis will keep it there. And so how do you do that right analysis, right? Do spend analysis. So companies who routinely perform spend analysis, they uncover those huge savings potentials, right? The driving changes such as consolidating purchase with fewer key strategic suppliers could save you millions of dollars, right? And so I could tell you, large manufacturing facility, and some of you guys work on aircraft and engines, those sealants, right? Anybody familiar with B1.5, B2, B4 sealants? When you guys work in the engine shops, you gotta know that sealant.
Yes, sir, I am.
Yeah. So you think about that. All of that stuff is environmentally controlled, right? So you have to refrigerate it prior to use, and then there's some mixture and whatnot, right? And so if you're a large manufacturing facility, so you think about it on a typical Air Force base or any DoD base, you're going to use that sealant when you change an antenna or do something, right? But it's not like a frequent thing. You're not using it every minute of every day, right? You're using maybe a tube of it a week, right? In a manufacturing facility, you're using tubes and tubes and tubes of that every hour, right? And so it could be expensive to look at it. It's all got a shelf life. There's a useful life, 6 months on a lot of that sealant. It has to be refrigerated until you use it, right? And then combine that with all your other consumable, expendable type products, your greases, your oils, your rags, your FOD bags, your tie straps, your safety wire, right? just by consolidating those purchases with fewer suppliers, right? And there's some specialty suppliers that will come in and do all of that. They'll cover all your hazmats, all your sealants, all your greases, all your oils, any paints, let them manage it instead of you buying as you need. And you consolidate that, there's some significant savings that if there's a high volume usage. In a lot of manufacturing facilities, you'll find a product that has a high volume usage. If you could consolidate some of those products with one supplier, significant savings, right? So any reducing that size of your supplier base, building supplier relations, decreasing your transaction volume. Transaction volume says, hey, I'm ordering 6 this month, I'm ordering 6 next month, I'm ordering 6. Decrease that order for an annual thing, and that saves money. You're not cutting individual purchase orders, you're not doing individual supplies, so decrease that transaction volume. And then improving lead times and your quality. I'll give you a good example of sealant, right? A typical tube of B2.5 is about $2-3, right? You could go buy this sealant, by the way. You go down to any local hardware store and get sealant, right? $2-3, right? And again, the airframe sealant has to be refrigerated until use, and there's a specific shelf life on this. So we got, and I mentioned that we have facilities in the UK. So the guys in the UK in the supply chain, if you buy that same sealant in the UK, it's like $8 a tube compared to like $2-3 a tube in the United States. Same sealant, same manufacturing specs of it. So somebody in the UK, one of the supply chain guys, decided, hey, I'm going to buy this stuff from the US because it's cheaper. Like, he's looking at the price of this thing. He says, I'm on the unit price of it. He says I could buy tubes for $3 versus $8. And so for months that was going on, and one just off the wall one day looking at it and say, why are we sending sealant to the UK? And then somebody said, well, I don't know. Let's look into it. So he talked to the guy. He said, well, it's cheaper. Unit price is cheaper. That sealant, one tube of sealant going from the US to the UK was costing us close to $1,000, right? Because the buyer was looking at just unit price. He wasn't looking at the transportation cost, the time of spent in import, export, the time of material that was wasted because it wasn't refrigerated or the shelf stock thing. It was absolutely insane. Spend the $8 in the UK and don't buy those materials, those consumable, expendable items from the US. It's the same thing. You wouldn't buy a gallon of milk from the UK to have it shipped to the US because it would be a lot of spoilers and stuff like that. So it's the same theory. So when you're looking at buying those supplies, anything that you could do to reduce the handling costs, the shipping cost, the export cost, the taxes cost, anything you do to shrink that would help. So don't always just look at unit price, look at the costs associated with getting that product into your organization, and you could save some significant. So that's part of a spend analysis that should always be considered. And by the way, that sealant example came when we were looking at spend items. What happens is large organizations are normally not looking at what they call the cats and dogs, the small commodity type things, right? Because they're buying millions of dollars. Like we talked last week, a jet engine is anywhere from $4.5 to $8 million. So they're looking at those big dollar items, and they're not necessarily looking at the small commodity items like sealants and solvents and hazmat materials. But again, if you're using volume there, it all adds up and you could get some significance. So that's why a spend analysis helps. So analysts such as this sample spend chart analysis, allows a company to rank their suppliers and their materials and their purchase by volume, right? And then this analysis could be a real eye-opener, like that Salem example, right? So purchase order transaction volume by size or of spend can reveal opportunities for alternate ways of procurement of materials, such as online cataloging and procurement cards, P cards. Some of you guys might be familiar with that, right? If we issue pretty much credit cards to some buyers, and we call them procurement cards because it's a lot cheaper to go buy $1,000 worth of rivets than it is to cut a purchase order, go to a supplier, get a quote, and then come back, right? You're going to spend hundreds of dollars in labor and resources to do that when you're going to just go bought the rivets because you knew it off of a procurement card. By the way, that's probably a bad example. Don't ever go buy $1,000 worth of rivets if you're using big volume, right? Go buy an annual supply of them and spend what you need to spend to get it, because you'll get, yeah. But anyway, spend analysis chart helps. So spend analysis aims can come from all kinds of different areas, right? But certainly collaborating, building that supplier relationship helps, right? Identify those strategic suppliers, and then moving towards supplier consolidation for purposes of volume discounts and higher quality. So I mentioned about a big aerospace company. There's companies out there that will handle all your hazmats for you. Let them do it. They're knowledgeable. They know what the rules are and the laws. When you're dealing with solvents and paints and other things, there's federal laws that you have to deal with. There's local laws that you have to deal with. There's state laws that you have to deal with. Those companies are experts in it. Don't spend the resources. Let somebody else do that if the volume's there, right? And then that helps to reduce all that maverick spend through your preferred suppliers and better process, right? And then avoid that spend leakage by monitoring compliance to your negotiated terms. A lot of folks don't do that. That's called a supplier management process. You sign a contract with a supplier for parts on a specific time at a specific cost at a specific capacity. Hold them to that. You sign a contract with them. And what happens is when we're looking at lower dollar items, a lot of folks don't manage that. Manage the entire thing. That helps. And then again, I talked about the procurement and the P card. That just slows down, it speeds up your transaction, and it gets rid of all that purchase order and the paperwork and all that administrative delay time. And then look at all your alternate sources, right, for improving their lead times and quality. And then here's two things that aren't on this chart, but strategic agreements and long-term agreements with your key suppliers. You lock in on a unit price for a couple of years. You lock in on a repair cycle time. You lock in on a production lead time. You lock in on your capacity. You say, hey, I need X amount of time, right? That's what the value of a spend analysis, right? If you're buying X amount of parts in your manufacturing line, and you know you're going to build the same amount of product in the next 6 months that you just built the last 6 months, look at where you get economies of scale. So could you buy 12 months of supplies and get a reduced rate from your supplier by buying 12 months instead of 6 months? A lot of suppliers will say, hey, yes, I'll give you a significant cost break by buying 12 months of supply versus 6 months. And then but don't think about that alone, right? Think about your holding costs, your inventory costs, and if you have to pay insurance on that, if you have to pay facilities, and then average it all out and see what the best optimum solution is. So that's all part of that spend analysis as well. It's part of your spend management program. And I just covered a ton of data. Any questions on any of that before we get into the next section? Anybody got anything to share before we talk about strategic cost initiatives? Matthew shared about kit making to deliver the doctor's office in a more efficient manner. I'm just catching up on the chat. So that's good example. So let's talk about strategic cost initiatives. All right. Handfill, this is a chart right out of the Handfill on page 210 of your textbook, right? So fundamental change in thinking once you move from your internally to externally focused supply chain initiatives. So you must develop a closer relationship with your key suppliers, right? It's all about the collaboration I've been talking about, and you can continue to hear me say that. So you must, and you also must pursue continuous performance improvements, right? Today, more companies are using target-based pricing to determine relevant price, right, that they must achieve for the new product to succeed. So examples of some of these cost reduction initiatives or strategies are as purchase volume leveraging with suppliers, right? Sort of example, like I said, 6 months or 12 months is that buy volume that you're going to need so you can leverage that with your supplier and get a better deal. That's called volume leveraging, right? And then supplier consortiums, right? That's where you're helping, you're working with your suppliers. We've gone in there and invested in our suppliers to help lean their production and improve their cross-docking, right? Again, I shared the definition of cross-docking with you guys last week. Cross-docking is anything that reduces the amount of time so your items, your product, your service is not sitting in a warehouse or sitting in a retail or wholesale facility or sitting on a shipping dock, right? Cross-docking means, okay, I'm moving this part from this deliverable method to the next deliverable method, and I'm getting it to my customer as quickly as I can, right? Do value engineering. Look at the easiest way to manufacture a product and deliver it, right? So, IKEA is great for that, right? IKEA does value engineering. They do everything so that they could make it as small as they possibly can in a shipping container to reduce that packaging and handling and shipping and transportation costs. And then they have an ideal supply chain where the wholesale facilities right there and their warehouses are combined with, and you just go right to a shelf and you pick your parts, you pick your items out and you go, right? So that's called value engineering. You're doing everything, you're designing, you're manufacturing all with the idea of reducing costs all the way along that. And then you're doing standardization. Again, IKEA does the same thing, right? They'll have the same size Allen wrench or hex key for all the nuts and bolts that you're going to put together their furniture with, right? And then they could do volume leveraging because they could buy the same hardware and do that, and they'll standardize that. It's the same thing if you're in almost any facility, right? If you're and this is where you got design for supportability comes into play, right? So if you've got designers that are manufacturing your next product, and I'll use an aircraft for example, right? So anybody who's worked on aircraft, they'll go through there and they'll say, they'll notice that, hey, I got all kinds of different size fasteners on here, different size rivets, different size panel fasteners, and so if you think about, if you're designing a new aircraft, and you can work with your designers and say, hey, we're going to standardize the fasteners. Use this rivet everywhere you can, and use this panel fastener everywhere you can. Now you're going to reduce the amount of parts that are in your supply chain. You're going to reduce the amount of tools required from the maintainers of that product, right? And so when you start standardizing and looking at the logistics considerations for your customers, you can really leverage that design for not only design for supply chain, but design for manufacturing, design for producibility, and design for supportability, right? So you want to do that. Look at those logistic considerations. Look at the standardizing as much as you can. Any reduction in the bill of material for any product will save money. Any standardization of that bill of material will also save money. Don't go with different size bolts and nuts, screws. Standardize the hardware as much as possible. Again, you'll save money. And then look at all those life cycles within your remanufacturing cycle. So we're going to talk, the following slides are going to discuss some of these in more detail. So one approach to discussion is we could break out in teams, but I think we'll just go through the slides for saving some time here. What time is it? Do a quick time check here. 9:30. Okay. Okay. So volume leveraging, like I mentioned, understand your total purchase expenditure and classifying those expenditures by commodity type families and consolidating those requirements to leverage purchase volume is a simple yet effective cost reduction strategy. And in your textbook, if you remember reading that, Hanfeld goes on to say it's surprising that many organizations don't fully utilize that. And that's true. The easiest way to save money is to do some volume leveraging, and not a lot of people talk about that. And so I just said commodity families. So a commodity is a general category or family of purchase items or services, like sealants and paints and solvents that are those hazmats, or rivets, bolts, nuts, and all those are all commodity type families. So you could consolidate a lot of that, right? And then the next example is cross-docking, right? So as I mentioned last week, cross-docking is a process that takes place at your distribution centers, right? And it covers any method for process shipments that avoids putting product into storage before sending it on to your retail stores or your other outlets, right? So Hanfeld talks about that in your reading in chapter 4. It really involves moving merchandise from your manufacturing to your customer in the shortest period of time. So anything you could reduce, if you reduce any of that cycle time by cross-docking, you could have some significant savings, right? And then design for supply chain management. We talked a little bit about that, right? Extends the concept of your design for manufacturing, which refers to that process of simplifying your product designs to allow easier manufacturing and assembly. And you take that to the broader scope of your entire flow of material across all your different supply chain entities. You're going to save money. And like I used the example, IKEA is a really great example, right? Because design complexity affects your performance both in the new product development cycle and throughout that demand fulfillment cycle. So studies have shown that product structure with the fewer end items and fewer levels in their bill of material are associated with lower inventory and higher customer satisfaction. Again, a good example is IKEA, right? And then what are the four main issues in design product? Right, so your transportation, your handling, your packaging is expensive, right? And then not only that, like IKEA looks at that, what they call monetary density and physical density. So monetary density is the volume per unit of weight, such as $1 per pound, right? That's where your shipping and your transportation costs, well, you could help reduce them. So look at that monetary density. IKEA packages everything great, so that they're keeping that low. And then your physical density is the same thing. It's your ratio of your cubic volume to your weight, right? You want to keep that. You want to keep it down as much as possible to a one-person lift, because that saves money again, right? When you're doing that. And then of course the stores in New Haven, Connecticut. There's actually two, right? There's the Hewlett-Packard Distribution Center, which is again, Hewlett-Packard is again another benchmark for supply chain management, and then IKEA headquarters, right? And so look at that. And then strategic costs, right? So when you're doing this, right, there's a number of important issues that you'll have to be addressed with respect to global supply chains, right? Understand those economic factors. Understand if there's any trade restrictions. Understand your import and export laws and the differences throughout those global markets, right? There'll be longer lead times in some areas, right? Because you have that bonded storage area, the import and export things, and others, right? So look at that. Understand from when you're dealing in a global, and then look at the transportation, your infrastructure, your legal constraints. Infrastructure is a good example, right? So Dell several years ago put a large facility in India, right? When they did that, the infrastructure wasn't exactly there, so they actually built the infrastructure, right? They built their own power plants, right? They built their own roads, their own streets, their own facilities, and invested quite a bit of money in India. With with paybacks, right? So you got, but you need to understand that, right? If you're going to outsource to particular countries, you need to understand the infrastructure that's there, right? If it's a country that you're going to lose electrical power, that's not going to help you in the manufacturing. But again, you're going to have to look at those transportation. You're going to have to look at those legal constraints and any other geopolitical thing that's in there, right? So one of the strategic cost initiatives that you read about in Hanfield in chapter 5 on pages 234, 236 was target pricing and costs, right? So target pricing is an approach used in initial stages of new product development cycle. It's to establish a contract price between a buyer and a seller, right? It takes into consideration your new product development cycle. Traditional pricing, which is your product cost plus your profit, normally equals your selling price. So with target pricing, a product's allowable cost is strictly a function of what a market segment is willing to pay, less the profit goals for that product, right? So we won't go through all these questions, but if you read if you read your reading assignments, you're going to get all of that. We won't do the in-class conversation. Another cost initiative is total cost of ownership, right? This is where it identifies and measures those costs beyond your standard unit price, right? It's a sum of all your expenses, your equipment, your tooling, any resources that are involved, any services that you have coming in to sustain your equipment, and then all those costs across the supply chain. There's a metric off of the Supply Chain Council website that a lot of folks are doing. It's the total cost of supply chain. A lot of organizations want to know what that total cost. That total cost consists of all kinds of costs, right? The cost to hold the inventory, the cost to insure your inventory, the tax of your inventory, your supplier management costs, your resource costs, any of your IT costs, your data mining costs, your MRP costs, right? And so the total cost of supply chain is a valuable metric when you're talking total cost of ownership. An approach to the development of that total cost measurement is identify items that need total cost, right? Map those material flows again, right? Map the material flow process, helps identify activities affected by the end of that, looks at the dollar that's associated with it, captures all your other data. Understand your defect rates, right? Understand your non-conformance costs, right? When your suppliers are giving you product that has quality issues and you're shipping them back or reworking them or doing something, that's an expensive cost, right? If you got a relationship with your supplier, you expect first time quality, you expect a deliverable, right? It's just like when we go buy something from a consumer, and we buy a TV or a computer or a tablet or a new smartphone, and we use that product, we expect that thing to work all the time, right? We don't expect to see any non-conformance quality issues, and that's what you should be doing with your suppliers, regardless of the volume that's coming in. And so we're not going to go through. So anyway, these are some examples of what's in that total cost. I just mentioned earlier, there's all kinds of things, right? It's just not it's your packaging cost, anything, your transportation, shipping, handling cost. Look at all handling. Anytime a part is touched, it's costing you money, right? Anything that's defective is costing you money. Look at your warranties. Look at your service costs. Go through that. Lot of things. That thing. We're not going to do this case study. One of the other things that you'll see a lot in the industry today is activity-based costing. So that captures all the costs associated with building a product or developing a service. So if you're in an engine shop and you're doing a routine type engine maintenance, you could do like an activity-based cost. You can say, okay, I'm now going to overhaul this C-130 Rolls-Royce engine, and here's the steps I'm doing, and every step of that process is is a cost, right? It's a labor cost. You're using material as you're going through it, so you collect all that cost, and that's called activity-based costing. That's the simple method for activity-based costing. That helps to you as an organization to understand all the costs associated with any activity, right? And then you could look at those exact support levels of supply chain strategies, right? What's going on in your organization, those corporate strategies, those business unit strategies, those supply chain strategies. There's got to be a correlation there, right? The commodity or process strategies that we talked about, consolidated material. Again, read the textbook. Hanfield goes into a lot of details on that. Total supply chain management cost is the sum of all of everything that's associated, right? It's that order management, that material acquisition, that inventory carrying, that supply chain finance, your planning, your MRP costs, everything associated with it. Valuable thing to know if you're running a big organization, what your total supply chain cost is. And that's where you're going to help to see if you're in the industry standard or if you have some initiatives that you need to be. And these here, again, from the Supply Chain Council, this slide here is just showing you some of those best in class averages. Of course, this is a little bit dated, but you could see, I'm going to circle the dates on here. Anytime I see 90s, I say, okay, we gotta fix that. But we'll update that. But it's always good to understand that and then compare them against the best in class industries and the averages. Again, if you went to the Supply Chain Council website, you'd get an updated chart like from there. So I covered a whole bunch of information. We're at 9:40, gives us time for discussion. So anything on what I covered tonight? I know I went through some of it really quick, but again, do your reading. You're gonna that textbook is an easy read, and Hanfield really goes into a lot of detail on what we covered. So, questions? Man, you guys are quiet. You guys still there? You guys all still there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, quickly in summary, right? Understand your organization's core competencies. Look at where those sweet spots are. That's where you're going to really focus on there. And then insourcing and outsourcing really requires you to understand what your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. And then strategic supply and cost management is going to provide the best return on any process within a large manufacturing organization, where 56% of every dollar of revenue goes towards your supply chain material. So any significant improvement in your supply chain is going to yield some significant financial savings and cost avoidance for your organization. Okay, I covered a lot. If you got any questions, shoot them out. It doesn't have to pertain to what we covered tonight. I'm going to stay on the line here for the next 10 minutes. So if you guys got any questions, stick around. If you don't, have a good evening.
Good night.
Night, sir.